Look, it's not entirely clear at the moment exactly what Manasseh Sogavare does or doesn't want with this review. The announcement, such as it was pretty glancing and brief. It was buried in a press release that he issued after meeting Richard Marles. Now, Richard Marles, the Australian Defence Minister, who's in Honiara, or who has been in Honiara the last 2 days, is really playing down the significance of this review. He's basically saying that it's simply an attempt to update the bilateral security treaty to reflect the fact that there is currently, and has been since 2021, an Australian group of troops and police on the ground, along with New Zealand and Fijian personnel. There's no reference to that in the security treaty because it predates it. And so he's basically saying that the Solomon Islands wants to do nothing more than refresh it to sort of reflect that reality. Now, Manasseh Sogavare's conception of what he wants to do may be slightly different, but it's not entirely clear. Some inside the government of Solomon Islands have said that they think that Mr. Sogavare wants to ensure that there isn't any sort of gap between things going wrong and Australian troops responding. You might remember when the current contingent came in at the end of 2021, there was some kickback or some criticism from Manasseh Sogavare immediately after their arrival. He claimed that they'd arrived too late, and the riots which they'd come to quell had already done an awful lot of damage. Now, it's worth noting Australia pushes back forcefully on that. They say Australia responded as quickly as they humanly could, and they also reject allegations that Sogavare has made about Australia refusing to protect Chinese infrastructure. But it's because of that bad blood that I think some analysts' eyebrows were raised when they saw this line about a review. Australia, it seems, is pretty relaxed and doesn't feel like it's going to pose any sort of challenge to security cooperation, doesn't feel like it will weaken or dilute Australia's security presence in the country, but we'll simply have to see.
Yeah. Stephen, of course, Minister Marles is really trying to secure the relationship and ensure that Solomons understands that Australia is there for the country, for the nation. What else came from this visit?
I think the most interesting thing that came out of this visit was probably the statement that Richard Marles made, both before he departed, but then more vociferously when he was actually in Solomon Islands, about Australia's desire to keep Australian troops and police in the country beyond the deadline of December 2023, which was previously in place. Now, it's worth remembering the history here. Australian police and troops were in Solomon Islands for 14 years, from between 2003 to 2017 under the Ramsay Project. After that, they left. There was about a 3 or 4 year gap before disorder once again visited itself upon Honiara. Riots in November 2021. Manasseh Sogavare again issued a call to Australia to come in, and very quickly Australia did, to restore order with both police and ADF personnel. Now, that was always pitched as a short-term measure by the then Morrison Liberal government in Australia. Scott Morrison said he expected it would last most likely, for weeks or perhaps months. The Pacific Minister at the time insisted it was a short-term mission, but perhaps 6 months after that, it was effectively extended until December 2023. And now Richard Marles, in the lead up to this visit, and then also today, while he was actually on the ground, made it very clear that the Labor government would be comfortable for those troops to stay as long as Solomon Islands was comfortable for them to be there. Now, this is a shift. It's effectively now morphing into something perhaps comparable, if not in scale or size just yet, but perhaps loosely comparable to some sort of Ramsay Mark II. And that is not what we were talking about in the first place. So it is significant and worth noting. Now, of course, there's no guarantee that Manasseh Sogavare is going to agree to this extension. He is notoriously combustible and can be quite prickly, particularly when it comes to Australia. Any suggestion that Australia is assuming that it can do something without his permission is likely to be greeted with a great deal of hostility. We haven't yet got a clear indication that his government will be willing to give this a green light, but clearly Australia under Anthony Albanese and Richard Marles is making it very clear that they're willing to stick around for the long term. And of course, the clear driver here is absolutely not just doubts about, stability in Solomon Islands. There's going to be an election next year in 2024 that's been delayed, and there's already anxiety about whether there might be unrest around that. But also, more importantly, anxiety about China in some way encroaching on what is traditionally Australia's territory, if you like, as the security partner of choice. The last thing Australia wants to see is, for example, riots in Chinatown again, and then Solomon Islands calling on the Chinese government to bring in Chinese police to quell those riots. In Australia's view, that would not only potentially be deeply destabilising, it would also stoke racial tensions in the country, and of course also provide a precedent that strategically Australia would be deeply, deeply anxious about. So I think that's the backdrop there. That's why Richard Marles is saying, look, we are willing to stay as long as you are willing to keep us there, because he does not want China filling the breach, particularly if things get a little bit fraught in coming years. As I say, the main question now is whether Manasseh Sogavare is going to be comfortable with that.
Yeah. Good to talk, Stephen. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Beverly. I really appreciate it.